You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for June 15th, 2018. This week, I'm going to talk about an AHA nutrition educational statement, the PREDIMED retraction, ECG screening, and lifelong learning. The first topic today is that the AHA has released a scientific advisory statement which recommended training physicians to provide diet and nutrition counseling. Get this quote: guideline-based diet behavior counseling that's initiated by physicians on the front lines of primary and specialty care can improve outcomes in individuals, and if coupled with 21st century disease prevention and health promotion strategies, holds immense potential for improving population-wide cardiovascular health. Now, based on the retraction of PREDIMED, one of cardiology's most influential studies, this grand proclamation is sort of funny. Well, I wonder what exactly is the sort of nutrition training they will give the younger docs, and what RCT evidence will they cite that one diet is better than another. Now, more on that to come in the second topic, but seriously, the AHA doesn't really have a great track record on nutrition advice. The lower your fat intake of my generation really did not work out so well, given that we mostly have a carbohydrate-powered obesity crisis. In the most recent AHA presidential advisory statement on dietary fats, kept their strong recommendation for polyunsaturated fats, vegetable oils, rather than saturated fats from animal fats. Of course, this recommendation is based on selective picks of the literature, and it flies against the findings of the PURE study, the largest, albeit observational study of recent times. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we give enough attention or emphasis on lifestyle and diet with our patients, but one hardly needs to burn valuable time in med school to tell people to make basic choices on calorie restriction and daily exercise, and to emphasize to doctors the importance of lifestyle in treating patients. Now, if we were going to teach nutrition, I'd recommend teaching its history and how to understand the many flaws of studies in nutrition science. The lessons learned from that critical appraisal would really serve medical doctors quite well. Now on to one of the biggest medical stories of recent years. It's hard to know where to begin with the PREDIMED retraction and republication of the study in the New England Journal. Should I begin with the fact that one doctor, a regular doctor working by himself, in addition to his normal duties as an anesthesiologist, discovered irregularities in nearly 100 published clinical trials, including papers in major medical journals. Now note that these were irregularities missed by journal editors and peer reviewers. Or should I begin with the fact that the PREDIMED results swayed one of the most important debates in global public health, and that is, what is the most healthful type of diet? Remember, the original PREDIMED trial has been cited more than 1,800 times. Or should I begin with the fact that if a trial vetted by the venerable New England Journal of Medicine process could have this many irregularities, what does this say about how we should interpret other major clinical trials? Let's briefly review what the original PREDIMED trial was. Now, emphasis on was. It was a multi-center RCT from Spain with approximately 7,500 older people, average age about 67 years, randomized into three groups: Mediterranean diet with free olive oil, Mediterranean diet with free nuts, and advice to reduce fat intake was the control group. The primary endpoint was a composite of MI, stroke, or CV death, and the trial was stopped early. The original trial showed statistically significant reductions, about 30% reductions in the primary endpoint for both Mediterranean diets that supplemented with olive oil and the one supplemented with nuts versus a control group. Now, here's the key thing. Because this original study was a randomized controlled trial and all other factors were presumably held constant, the authors could rightly claim causality. In other words, they could say consumption of a Mediterranean diet supplemented with either olive oil or nuts caused people to have fewer CV events. Now, PREDIMED wasn't without criticism at the time, and it had some weaknesses. And these included the fact that it was a composite endpoint that was driven only by stroke. The trial was stopped early, which biases toward the intervention usually. And midway through the follow-up, the control group intervention was changed because of concerns that the placebo arm was not receiving enough education. Now imagine if a drug trial was stopped and was changed 3 years into it because patients weren't really receiving placebo. So that problem biases toward the intervention. Now, in an interesting Public Library of Science, or PLOS, blog post, Hilda Bastian, who's an expert on evidence, noted that some systematic reviews, including one by NICE, National Institute for Care Excellence in the UK, judged PREDIMED to be at serious risk of bias. Now let's get on to the PREDIMED redo. Now the reason there were problems with PREDIMED came to light was this Dr. John Carlisle's analysis. Now, Carlisle was the anesthesiologist in the UK who took it upon himself to analyze these trials. And his method is complex, but basically the way I understand it is this. He looks at the distribution, not of the results, but of the baseline variables in the trial, say height and weight, in about 5,000 trials he looked at. And remember, in a proper RCT, the baseline variables, and crucially their standard deviation, should be similar between the two groups, and the p-values for comparison of the variables should follow a normal distribution, meaning most of them should be no difference. So Carlisle's method finds papers in which the baseline characteristics exhibit a too narrow or too wide a distribution that's expected by chance, and this results in an excess of p-values close to either 1 or 0. Now, in his original paper, where he published this work, Carlisle named names of trials, and one of them was PREDIMED. And to the PREDIMED authors' credit, they went to the trouble to reanalyze the data, and it looked like a big project. And indeed, they found that Carlisle was right about their trial. The authors found about 1,500 patients, approximately 20% of the study population, could have been affected by irregular randomization. So the authors reanalyzed the PREDIMED, and the reanalysis upheld the original trial's findings. They found that fewer people assigned to the Mediterranean diet with either olive oil or nuts had primary endpoint events. But now the wording of the conclusion had to be different. The new paper is more like an observational study, and instead of saying the Mediterranean diet reduced MACE, or major adverse cardiac events, they had to say in the passive voice, the incidence of MACE was lower among those assigned to Mediterranean diet than among those on low-fat diets. And the limitations aside with this new analysis, the investigators do make a compelling case for the Mediterranean diet. I mean, they did 3 types of analysis to correct for the irregular randomization. They did propensity weighting. They then did an analysis where they omitted subjects with the irregular randomization, and the results did not change. And thirdly, when they considered the degree of adherence to the diet, they found that those that adhere more to the Mediterranean diet had even more reduction in events. So the implications, the medical question at hand is, what does this mean for nutrition science? Because before the retraction, in the best diet for heart health debate between the pro-fat Mediterranean diet proponents and those of the Dean Ornish and Esselstyn plant-based low-fat proponents, the Mediterranean diet proponents had a proper RCT that was vetted in the New England Journal of Medicine in their camp. Now they have a pretty strong observational study. So honestly, truthfully, I don't really know what is the absolute best diet. When patients ask me that in the office, I'm just uncertain. And some specific comments on nutrition studies. I mean, the major problem with nutritional research is that most of it is observational. And think about it. How can we possibly do a proper RCT of diet in the current era? I mean, experts rightly say we would need tens of thousands of patients in a trial to achieve statistical power to show a difference in significant outcomes. And then you have the problem of keeping this many free people adherent to the regimen. And then there's the problem that we have, it's not really a problem, but it's a problem for studies, of declining cardiovascular death incidence and increasing comorbid conditions as people live longer with comorbidity. So we're just going to have to accept uncertainty in recommending the best diet and avoid the hubris of thinking we know the right answer. And finally, some comments on PREDIMED retraction in terms of medical science. Remember in 2005, the Stanford professor John Ioannidis wrote a strong paper explaining why most published research is false. His main arguments were not that most published research is fraud. It's not. It was a host of other things, like bias or underpowered studies or small effect sizes or flexible study designs, and also the incentives of researchers to find certain, usually positive results. And the way I take Ioannidis' paper, having read it many, many times, and the news of retractions like PREDIMED is not to be nihilistic about research, but to be more of a slow adopter and to be more skeptical of what we think we know. I mean, Carlisle's revelations have reminded us how hard it is to make true medical progress, which is okay. Uncertainty is one of the things that makes being a doctor fun. Third topic today is on ECG screening. Now, the United States Preventive Services Task Force, the USPSTF, newest statement on ECG screening in asymptomatic adults upholds its stance from 6 years ago. That is, don't do an ECG in low-risk individuals, those with less than 10% 10-year risk of heart disease, because there is adequate evidence it leads to harms that range from small to maybe moderate. That's a pretty important statement. They're saying don't do it, not because it's not beneficial. They're saying don't do it because it could be harmful. They also further concluded that there was insufficient benefit versus harm evidence to recommend whether resting or exercise ECG testing should be performed in asymptomatic adults who are at intermediate or even high cardiovascular risk. Now, this recommendation just doesn't come out of the blue. It comes from an extensive systematic review, and it makes perfect sense to me. I mean, my endorsement of not doing ECGs in asymptomatic people may sound a bit off because I've already said that I love the ECG, and I do it on most patients I see in EP clinic. I think we can see a lot from the EKG. But the problem is that in the primary care setting, the ECG does not really increase CV risk determination. And because of the general erosion of ECG reading skills, the ECG can lead to oodles of unnecessary testing. From a Bayesian point of view, the priors of doing an ECG are quite different in a primary care versus EP clinic setting. Now, I've seen this firsthand, this overtreatment and unnecessary testing, and in fact, harms from downstream testing was one of the main arguments I used to oppose digital health advocates at the recent California ACC meeting. I presented a case during that presentation where an abnormal heart rate led to an ECG, and an ECG got a patient into the system, and he ended up suffering a complication from the large numbers of downstream tests, all for an asymptomatic person. An ECG is a great tool for clinical diagnosis, but it is a lousy screening tool. There's just too much misdiagnosis out there. Final topic today is on maintenance of certification and lifelong learning. Now, there are many, many things that frustrate U.S. doctors these days. And top on that list are performance measures that actually measure how well we click boxes rather than how well we perform as doctors. Now, in the Annals of Internal Medicine, a journal usually known for its selection of high-quality work, is a paper from authors associated with the American Board of Internal Medicine, and that paper finds an association between maintenance of certification and performance. Now, this was an observational study that looked at about 1,200 docs. It was not randomized, and there were 780 or so who did the maintenance of certification and 470 or so who did not. The authors found that those who did maintenance of certification scored slightly higher on performance measures, such things as drawing a hemoglobin A1C twice yearly or ordering mammography. And again, these were not outcomes. These were just things that can be measured on click boxes. This is a terribly feeble study. I mean, first, it's observational, but more importantly, the effect sizes were small in absolute terms. The endpoints are nearly worthless. In fact, The fact that we measure these things is one of the main frustrations of primary care clinicians, and it's one of the things that get in the way of taking care of people in a kind and gracious way. I agree with my friend Wes Fisher, who commented on the story. Dr. Fisher called it a marketing propaganda for the ABIM. Now, another paper cited in the same news story and published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine linked the lack of maintenance of certification with higher rates of disciplinary action by state medical boards. Again, this type of stuff is confounded observational work that does not at all suggest causation. The issue here, maybe for our international listeners, is how American doctors show competency. Rather than just show that you've done your CME, here you have to pay fees to the ABIM and do their brand of CME. Other types of CME don't necessarily count. What's more, the ABIM have partnered with our professional societies, and our professional societies sell board review materials. And don't get me wrong, I am 100% for lifelong learning. In fact, learning is one of my hobbies. But I am 100% against one company having a monopoly on their type of learning. So that's it for This Week in Cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. This is John Mandrola from the Heart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.